welcome to On the Issues with Michelle Goodwin at Ms. Magazine platform. As you know, we're a platform that reports with bells and we tell it just like it is. In this special episode, we're unpacking the manosphere. What's happening to men these days and boys? It's a question that's being asked with the high rates of gun violence, domestic violence, and so much more. And as we learned from our guests, men are hurting too. How do we explain what this cultural moment is all about? Well, joining me are very special guests to help us unpack what this means for our society, for our culture, for law, and every other space of our society. I'm joined by Dr. Gary Barker. He has been a global voice in engaging men and boys in advancing gender equality, gender justice, and positive masculinities for more than 3 decades. He is the CEO and co-founder of Equimundo Center for Masculinities and Social Justice, a major contributor to international activism on male allyship and gender equality. I'm also joined by our regular guest, Dr. Jackson Katz. He's an internationally renowned pioneer and scholar, activist on issues of gender, race, and violence. He has long been a major figure and thought leader in the growing global movement of men working to promote gender equality and prevent gender violence. And rounding out our panel is a very special guest, Cody Thompson. He's a program coordinator at the Center on Addiction and Public Policy and the Center for Community Health Innovation. He's at the O'Neill Institute for National and Global Health Law. Friends, sit back and take a close listen. Jackson, let me start with you. We've been in podcasting together. I'm so grateful for your leadership and for lending us your expertise at Ms. Magazine. Can you tell us about this special issue that you've done and what your thought process was in curating it?
Sure. Well, I'm guest editing this special men's section in the summer edition. I was asked by Camille Hahn, the managing editor, and Kathy Spillar, the executive editor and publisher, if I could pull together a number of different voices of men and talking about some of the issues relating to men and young men in a racially diverse and ethnically diverse and intersectional way, because there's so many issues that are exploding all around us in the culture, politically, socially, and other ways, in terms of men and masculinities, and so we, in this special issue, we're highlighting some of the key issues. I mean, men's health, the broadcasts, and the media space that the right has been so successful at reaching out to men, especially young men. The ways in which Garrett Bucks writes a brilliant piece about the ways in which J.D. Vance is sort of narrating a certain kind of masculinity and an outreach to young men by appealing to some notion of them as being able to tell jokes and be like a bro, when in fact policy and other issues are not even part of that conversation. And yet Garrett's piece plays on the fact that J.D. Vance has a certain seating posture, and it's kind of like a almost satirical way of looking at the way that J.D. Vance is sitting as a stepping off point to talk about how kind of superficial this outreach to men and young men is, but it's actually appealing to something real, and it's effective. And I write my pieces about the history of the right-wing media and how gendered the right-wing media outreach to men has been for decades. Not just the broadcasts are the newest manifestation of it, but I talk about Rush Limbaugh and right-wing talk radio and Fox News, and how they're not just telling the news in a certain slanted way. They're actually narrating a story about manhood that is bringing right-wing men into that conversation. And finally, I mean, I was really happy and honored that they excerpted my new book, which is called "Every Man: Why Violence Against Women is a Men's Issue and How You Can Make a Difference." And there's a lengthy excerpt in the book, which is about to be published in the fall by Bloomsbury Publishing. So all these pieces together, I think, form a very, I hope, interesting and not comprehensive, but a broad discussion about some of the key issues relating to men and masculinities in the current moment. And I was I have to say, Michelle, very honored that Ms. featured this. And I'm going to be, and a lot of us are going to be pushing this out into our networks, because Ms. being the leading feminist magazine in the world and has been for a long time, featuring men in this way is special. And I really appreciate it.
Well, a lot of people don't know that the cover itself is a repeat of a cover from the 1970s that actually had Robert Redford, his backside. So now, Dr. Gary Barker, your work looks at quite closely matters of gender and masculinities. And you've been doing this for quite some time, even though the conversation has really pivoted in very loud ways in recent years. Can you give me some sense about why you went down this path, and then what it is that you're seeing today that's perhaps motivating new ways that you're looking at your work?
Yeah. So, the organization that I founded, we started work in Brazil and Latin America, focused on what's up with men and how do we bring men along in if feminism created a revolution in the world, where are men in the story? That men needed to be allies, and we believe to see themselves as beneficiaries in the story as well. That a world that is safe and fair for all of us is one where men should see our lived stake in it. So we've been asking questions about that, doing work with young men, creating campaigns together with governments. And then we've been working in the US in the last 15 years and have seen just how much, we're going backwards. Men's views in the US and many countries they're more likely to oppose the things that all of us and that Ms. Magazine stands for, of believing that, women should be all the places they want to be, that ending violence against women is the right thing to do, women's rights to control what they do over their bodies. And men are going into more deeply into a view of manhood that says, I'm in charge. I'm the one who gets to say what happens. I don't need to stop and ask questions. I don't show that I'm vulnerable. So there's a deep, I think what worries us at the moment, there's a deep economic and social precarity that men feel. And I think we have trouble on progressive sides being able to acknowledge that we've got to make sense of that. It's not just saying, this is all fine and men just have to figure it out. We've got to step in there with some greater understanding. And I'd say in some spaces, we've got to step in even with compassion about why do men feel this kind of existential threat in a world that is, on the one hand, demanding equality from them, and on the other hand, deep shifts in the world that make it so that what would offer us livelihoods and a sense of well-being and kind of some sense of who we are in the world is being ripped out from under us. I think there's a lot of good reasons for that, but there's also a deep sense of confusion that I think we've got to step into instead of brushing over.
And it seems to me that an important part of this conversation that we see unfolding in these times is what's happening with young men. I've been in so many conversations with women who see themselves as progressive, who see their husbands as progressives. Yeah. And they say, but we don't know what's happened to our son. Our son doesn't sound like his dad. Jackson, I want to ask you, why is that? Then I want to turn to Cody to also help us unpack some aspects of this.
Sure. Well, I think partly what young men are reflecting is that, what they've been hearing and the narrative that's been shaped especially in the online spaces that so many young men inhabit. And the right, the political right and the cultural right has had near sort of narrative dominance in that ecosphere that young men inhabit. And so whether it's the, broadcasts, podcasts, chat rooms, online spaces of all kinds, I think they hear over and over again from charismatic voices, and Joe Rogan is obviously the most well-known, but he's not the only one. There's a whole bunch. And Andrew Tate is the most extreme manifestation of the manosphere, the misogynist manosphere. But obviously these guys they're speaking to something, as Gary and his, and the State of American Men report that Gary and his organization Equimundo just put out. We have so much data that shows that young men are not necessarily ideologically drawn to the right, but they are drawn to a sense of brotherhood, camaraderie, connection, wanting a sense of meaning and purpose in their life. And they're finding that in some of these online spaces. And by the way, some of the online universe that so many of these young men inhabit, it's not explicitly political. They don't talk, I mean, they might mention politics, but it's really about sports and relationships and physical fitness and other non-political subjects. And then they smuggle in some of the political discourse. And by the way, that's what the Trump administration understood. They understood that if they put Donald Trump in those spaces with these guys, it's not necessarily that they're talking about ideology or they're talking about policy. They're just kind of hanging out. And it creates a certain sense of authenticity that these young men feel and a sense of relatability. And I think the left and progressives and feminists haven't been anywhere near as successful at getting into those spaces, into those conversations. And so I think the opportunity is great that we have, but I think we're in a crisis mode because what's happened as a result of our not being in those spaces.
Well, it strikes me that it's also a bit of crisis for these young men in terms of what they're experiencing and then what they do with the crisis within. So I want to turn to Cody, who's been quite a courageous kind of storyteller in his own right about his own story, about being very bright, doing great things, but being trapped in some ways within this sort of need of upholding a certain vision of himself. And then what that meant in terms of addiction, which he talks about. So Cody, if you could tell us a little bit about what your journey was, because really, you're the young person on this podcast here who has a story to tell about just what that's like from that Midwest point of view that you came from of trying to uphold the masculinity, the masculine space. What was that like?
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you for holding space today. Growing up in a small Midwestern town, the version of masculinity we're discussing was definitely very present. And that's what was expected of me from my father, from boys at school. And, it was difficult because I didn't want to be that way. I couldn't mold myself to be that way because that just wasn't who I was. And so I got picked on and bullied, and that caused me to turn inward and isolate. And, that trauma and that isolation allowed me to build this shell where I didn't talk about my feelings. I didn't talk about anything. And that can be very detrimental to one's health. And, I just think that thinking about all the boys and men across the country who are forced to be someone through this culture that maybe they don't want to be, they're suffering. And, men and boys go through trauma, they experience suffering. And if we can't allow them to process the way they need to, such as showing emotion, being vulnerable, asking for help, it's just going to get worse. And they're going to turn to other ways of coping, such as substance use. And that was my story. That, it's funny to say, but the first time I drank alcohol, I felt like I was safe, and because I felt comfortable in my skin for once. It took away the edge. It took away that feeling of not being good enough, and the story goes on. So thank you.
Gary, I'd love to turn to you after hearing then Cody's story, part of Cody's story in terms of wanting to fulfill a certain masculine identity, being expected to, but then being bullied when clearly other people didn't think that he was living up to their projected ideals of masculinity, and that internal suffering, which then meant this next part, which was, here's a drink, and turn to that. How do you hear that? And do you think that his story is not unusual? I mean, I think it's probably not unusual.
Yeah, Cody, thanks for sharing that. I mean, I do think it's universal. I grew up in Houston, Texas, moving from California, where I was more into flip-flops and surfing, and then went to a land of pickup trucks and guns and a school shooting that happened in my school. And those of us who witnessed it, girls sought help. They sought solace with others. Guys looked at the ground. We didn't talk about it. They sent us back to class the exact same day. And really this silence. And I was glad that you put words to trauma. I mean, we know that you don't get through boyhood without experiencing some violence from other men and boys, whether it's bullying, and now we have new online forms, or some physical form, right? It is sadly how we too often kind of make manhood, right? That repress your feelings of vulnerability. And, we've got some guys over here who are policing you if you don't live up to this version of what we think manhood should be. We've been both, we work on that. We try to engage teachers and after school programming around how do we have healthier conversations around manhood. We could talk a lot more about the trauma part. What I'm encouraged about, something you said before, Michelle, which is I think there's a lot more concern about young men's mental health these days. Our previous Surgeon General talking about loneliness. Our data finds of young men in the US, ages 18 to 25, about a third of them don't see anyone outside their home on a weekly basis. So think of that, that isolation and everything Jackson just talked about, they also tell us, not surprisingly, that about half say their online lives are more interesting than their offline lives. So, if you're pouring all of your personhood into these online spaces, just how vulnerable you are to being swayed one direction or another. The other we're finding is that close to half of guys, same again, young men, have a feeling of some suicidal idea in the last 2 weeks. Half of guys. And then the third part, I'm sorry, these are not very happy data points, but I think we need to talk about them. About 3/4 say that no one cares if men are okay these days. So you're feeling alone, you're feeling desperate, and you've got this feeling that no one worries about whether you're okay. Interestingly, about half of women in the US also told us that no one cares if men are okay these days. So we've got that's the deep vulnerability that young men are perceiving. In saying all that, I don't want to say that our daughters, sisters, partners, mothers, wives are doing okay. Women are feeling lots of deep uncertainty with a president who's, a legally recognized sexual assaulter. So there's lots of reasons we're all not okay. But for young men, there's not a social space that says, I can reach out and say, I'm not doing okay. So I think that very challenging perfect storm of young men's social isolation is something we've got to step into for young men's well-being, but also because we know the more that young men feel that sense of isolation, they're also willing to tear down our democracy. And Jackson, I know you've done a lot of that thinking as well. And we find this in our data, and we find it listening to men. They're ready to say, nobody believes in me. Nobody cares if I'm okay. So I'm okay if we just tear it all down.
That's pretty powerful what you were saying. So on that point, I want to turn back to Cody, then to Jackson in terms of what that looks like politically. But I want to turn back to Cody to just then talk about then what then was your journey? You spoke about part of it, but I think it's actually important for people to be able to actually hear, because part of what you're saying is with the being socially isolated, feeling as if the only space that you have is online, then it's really feeling as if nobody's listening and nobody cares to listen. So Cody, perhaps you might give us a little bit more of a voice into, okay, what happens after a first drink? What does that look like? And recognize that that's your story, but your story probably isn't all that different from what a lot of guys are experiencing.
So my first drink when I was a teenager, and it wasn't unmanageable at first, but it became unmanageable when I went to college. And unfortunately, because of my very low self-esteem and mental health, because I knew at that point I was gay and I was living in the closet mixed with an undiagnosed substance use disorder. I wasn't going to class. I didn't really have friends. Isolated, and so I failed out of school. And failing out of school, I just felt so embarrassed and down on myself. I felt like a failure. And so my life spiraled out of control about 6 months later. And I just felt like I came to a breaking point where something needs to change, or I don't know if I'm going to survive. And so I went to treatment for the first time. And since then, it's been a process. Recovery is a journey. But I'm grateful that I was able to go back to school, receive a bachelor's, receive a master's. I'm about to start my second master's program. I want to pursue a Ph.D. So anything is possible, if you're able to turn your life around. And as we talk about young men who are suffering, we need to create that opportunity for them because it doesn't sound like there's an opportunity for them to heal or to be
Yeah.
connected to something that they're longing for, really.
Jackson, as you hear that and you think about your research, then how does that sit with you? And is there a connection between what Cody shares in terms of his story and the data points that we hear from Gary that tell us something about the America that we have today, about the political landscape in our country?
Sure. And again, I appreciate that Cody has the courage and strength to share this very vulnerable personal narrative. So thank you, Cody, for that, because it puts a human face and a human story on the sociological data that we have so much of. I would say, Michelle, one thing I think maybe that speaks to your question, and it also goes in a direction I think that is productive, is that feminism is not the enemy of men. Like, in other words, the idea that somehow feminism stands in opposition to men getting their needs met in the ways mental health needs, physical health needs, relational needs, so many of the issues that young men and older men struggle with. Feminism is not the antithesis of the solution to these problems. It actually gives us a path to think about those problems in a much more sophisticated way. And in fact, the men's health movement, I write about this in my book, Everyman, but the men's health movement, the growing movement of looking at ways in which cultural attitudes and ideologies and beliefs about manhood, and again, this is cross-cultural, it's global, but how cultural ideologies of masculinity and manhood are related to men's health and men's negative health outcomes, whether it's risk-taking behavior or other sort of medical problems that men have, as well as the lack of self-care and help-seeking behavior. In other words, going to the doctor, going to the dentist, in other words, taking care of their health needs. The growing movement of men engaged in that work, and Movember is one of the organizations. Gary's worked with them. They're a global organization looking at men's mental health more broadly. The men's health movement is a direct product and outgrowth of the feminist-led women's health movement, which, as you know, was started, well, one of the major events was the publication in 1972 of Our Bodies, Ourselves by the Boston Women's Health Book Collective. That was the first major intervention into the public discourse about how gender, especially in this case, femininity or women's, health was affected by, being second-class citizens in a patriarchal culture, as well as the way that the healthcare delivery system was set up for men and not for women. Anyways, the point is the men's health movement is the outgrowth of that feminist-led women's health movement, and some of the major architects in the men's health movement space openly credit feminist women and feminist women's intellectual, political, and cultural leadership for creating this new opening to talk more thoughtfully about men's experience. And yet you don't hear any of what I just said in the manosphere or in the public discourse.
No, you don't.
Right. You just hear the opposite. You hear that feminists hate men, and men have all these problems, and what about men? And the women have their needs being met, but what about the men? And it's just flat out ignorance of what I've just said, which is the connections between the two things. And one last thing about this.
Yeah. Because then I have a question about the archetypes and connecting back again to something that we heard from Cody. But finish up, Jeff.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you. One of the key concepts, and again, Gary's familiar with this, our friend Michael Kaufman, who's one of the co-founders of the White Ribbon Campaign, which is the largest global movement of men speaking out about men's violence against women. Michael wrote an essay in 1987 called The Triad of Men's Violence, where he connected men's violence against women is connected to men's violence against other men, which is connected to men's violence against themselves, because suicide is violence turned inward. And many of us in the pro-feminist space globally over the last 40 years plus have been making these sort of connections. In other words, we understand both implicitly and in other ways that thinking about changing cultural definitions of manhood and greater gender equity and built into policy at all different levels, fatherhood issues relate to this, is in men's self-interest. So it's in addition to being women's self-interest, in other words, gender equity being in women's self-interest. Of course it is. And again, intersectionally, in complicated ways, racially, ethnically, global north, global south. It's also in men's self-interest, but we have to make that point more strongly and break down these barriers.
Well, so here's what I want to get to in the next question, and time is running out for us, but there are archetypes. And it seems to me that when I hear Gary and I hear you, Jackson, and then what's triggering for me back with Cody is that Cody talks about how he grew up being bullied, how there was an expectation of what masculinity looked like. Gary, you talked about that too, coming from California, flip-flops, long hair, you get to Texas, whole different kind of landscape in terms of what it means to really do this guy work. Well, we're right now on the 10th anniversary of the Obergefell decision, where the Supreme Court approved same-sex marriage. And Justice Kennedy said this was about the dignity of the people. Well, it seems to me that one of the challenges of what you mentioned, Gary, of we're slipping backwards, is that what was opening up in terms of a door of there are different kinds of masculinities, different ways of being a man. You don't have to like carry an AK-47 or AR-15 and wear cowboy boots. Although you could be gay and wear cowboy boots and all those things. But it seems to me that now there is this concern about the performativity. What does it look like to be a real man? And it seems to me that that's part of the social space that we're entering right now. And Gary, I wonder if you could speak to that, Cody and Jackson, if you want to weigh in.
Listening to young men over the last months, a couple of things stand out. One is there's a strange moment, or anyway, there's a moment where they're feeling commodified, right? Our swipe left, swipe right moment where guys are feeling, I'm now being, to get a date, I'm now held up and scrutinized. More than close to 40% of them tell us in our survey research that they don't think they're going to find anybody who loves them or who will fall in love with them, right? So there is this feeling that, we've boxed ourselves into a kind of individualistic, it's all about what I perform, what I make. And if I'm anything less than, I'm just not interesting material for anybody. So I think, that's a piece of it. There's also a piece, and, Jackson and myself have been part of this movement of calling men out for harm, right? And when I say we've been part of it, we've been part of the talking to men part, but the whole, the years of feminist activism and Me Too have made necessary impact in the world that men are afraid of being called out. Young men are particularly afraid. Like we had guys telling us, I don't want to be that creep. You don't want to be the guy that now in social media, if a girl posts and says, he tried this with me, my reputation is destroyed in a single moment. Now, we know this was happening to women for lots of, sexist reasons for centuries. That guys are now feeling the sense that their reputation could be destroyed with a single comment. We might be tempted to say, well, yeah, welcome to what women have felt about the policing of their sexuality for centuries. But I don't think that's enough of a response. How do we step in and acknowledge this moment where, part of the backlash has a huge amount to do with this feeling that I can be called out, but I don't think we, whoever we are, society, parents, schools, progressive or, middle of the road media has stepped in with better scripts and ideas of what, a healthier version of manhood is. So I want to step into that moment of a backlash and watching, and say, let's stop lamenting and figure out how do we lean in with a version of manhood that helps men feel their sense of connection to others, helps them find their stake in the real and necessary benefits that feminism has brought to the world, so that we get out of this that men perceive, or a lot of young men perceive, that somehow feminism is against them. Because most of them, back to your point, Michelle, when we ask men separately from what do they think about feminism, vast majority, no matter how they vote, they believe in equal rights for folks who are non-heterosexual. They believe in equal economic rights for women. The fairness stuff, they are absolutely with us. So how do we step into that moment? And I think you brought a very good example of saying most guys are in favor of that ruling. How do we remind them that they believe in this version of fairness that we've been trying to promote?
Well, it makes me wonder about viewing what it is, viewing the man space on a spectrum.
Yeah.
But that seems to me not where we are. It seems that we were getting to that space, but it seems like there's a bit of a rollback. And so, Cody, I wonder if you have any thoughts on that. Do you sense a bit of a rollback? Do you have a sense that if you were reliving the life that you had, would you perhaps encounter the same, or would it be different?
I definitely do get that sense. I do feel like, especially even among friends, people are afraid to be who they are in public today, and it's terrifying. And I just want to make a comment about social media. You know, I think social media is very concerning for me, because what I've seen in my own life and people I'm friends with, it's really easy to tell when someone is influenced by social media or by their friends because they're trying to be someone that they're not, or maybe they necessarily don't want to be. And it's just very apparent in the way they operate and how they act. And it's just, I don't know, it's very sad to see. It's very sad to see people feeling like they need to live up to something that they're not or be someone they aren't, when they can just be who they are, and that's fine.
One of the saddest parts is that you think about a case like the Dobbs decision, which overturned Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood v. Casey, and Justice Thomas's concurring opinion, which was that, maybe we shouldn't be done. Maybe we need to look to same-sex marriage and perhaps even same-sex intimacy. One could be sort of read into his concurrence, and that is really disconcerting. All right, we have reached this point, sadly, in our recording where we turn to happy thoughts. And that's not a sad part. It just means that I don't have more time with you about all of this important data points that you were sharing, Gary, and that Jackson, you were speaking to, and that Cody, you were informing us about in terms of your own journey. All right. In each of our episodes, we ask our guests about a silver lining. That is to say, the world may not look like we want the world to look. We may still be on that journey towards a more just society, but there is hope on the horizon. And so, Jackson, I want to start with you. What do you see as a silver lining in these times, in spite of what's really clear in terms of the data that Gary presents?
Well, thank you, and thanks for the opportunity to say something positive. But I would say, Michelle, that the old saying, "In crisis, there's opportunity." I think what's happened as a result of the rise of right-wing populism and fascism, both in the United States but other parts of the world, a lot of people, including people on the progressive side of the political spectrum and feminists, are realizing that not paying attention to the needs of men and boys, or creating a narrative that includes men and boys, including, by the way, including white men, including heteronormative white men, including, in other words, the whole spectrum of men and men's experience, not including them in a really upfront way, has been catastrophic in its impacts. And that as a result of that catastrophe, now people are paying attention. And so people like Gary and myself and Cody and a whole bunch of others around the United States, but around the world, who have been doing this work, have built a whole architecture, intellectual architecture, libraries full of research. It's like we're not at a place where we were 30 or 40 years ago. We have enormous amounts of data. We have enormous amounts of people on the ground, whether it's in the academic space, in the activist space, men I'm talking about, and women and others who really have are much more conversant about these matters than a previous generation, than when Gary and I were young. And because we have this architecture of intellectual, political, and cultural sort of background and backdrop, we can enter these spaces more thoughtfully and knowledgeably than we could ever do before. And I think the opportunity is there. And I think that one of the things that I always say to people is, if you're really concerned about these matters, especially with men and young men, you don't start from scratch. Don't start from scratch. We have a lot of work that's already happened. So read, engage, go to the equimundo.org, website. There's so many resources out there. My book, Every Man, I'm trying to make the case in my book, Every Man, that we've been doing this work for a long time. What we need is to scale it up. We don't need to start from scratch. We need to scale it up. We need to get more effective. And last thing, I think, in a really positive way, I do think men respond positively. If you can, and to Gary's point about the calling out, and Gary and I both talk about this all the time, we need to call men in to positive leadership rather than always be calling them out for bad behavior. And I think if you can call men in other words, we need more men who have the guts to start saying these things in public. We need men in power, powerful positions in politics, in business, and in religious institutions who have the courage and strength to stand up and say some of these things and support gender equity and the needs of men and boys. I think a lot of men can hear that as a positive challenge in a way that I think is potentially transformative. So yes, we have lots of problems, but we also have lots of potential in the current moment.
Gary, what do you see as a silver lining in the times that we're in right now?
Yeah, trying to lean into Martin Luther King Jr.'s admonition to us that when it's dark enough, you can see the stars. I think when we see some of the worst versions of manhood playing out before us, we also see some of the most humane and caring versions of them. With a Trump, we also see a Tim Walz. That list could go on, right? I think we are beginning to see what it is that we need to fill in the blanks and that empty space around what is good manhood, which is ultimately good humanity. So that part, I'm trying to find as make optimism into an active verb. But I do see a lot of men finding more meaning in their roles as fathers. Men are doing more of the hands-on care work, not enough, but close to equal. We've got, the mental workload and all of that we still need men to work on. But men are finding more of their identity, those who are fathers or caregivers of others. I think there's a lot to lean into there. Of men seeing that care gives them meaning in their life, and that as they exercise their care muscles with others, they get pretty good and better at self-care as well. And I'm hoping that can turn into political care. If I care about my kids, I've got to care about my community. I've got to care that the planet's not on fire. I've got to care that heads of state are not bombing me or anyone else. So I do think, we've got to, as Jackson said, we've got to stop we've been telling men a lot of kind of the things they shouldn't do. And I think care gives us something that men do a huge amount, and lean into that as a way to say it's got to be a care about good things. It can't be caring about, you brought up AR-15s and all the rest. We need men to care about the right things. But I do find optimism there. I think men can see their roles as caregivers and find a way to our better selves.
Thank you so much for that, Gary. And Cody, we'll wrap up with you. What do you see as a silver lining in these times?
Well, now having spoken on this issue, I do feel a responsibility to continue speaking about it. And it's a good thing, sharing my lived experience with other people, hoping that will help them and empower them to share their experience. I'm optimistic that my generation can make a difference and continue to carry this work forward, with hope that more men will become anti-sexist and support women and care for women. So I'm just really grateful for this conversation, and I think there's a lot of opportunity to connect with other men and for healing to take place.
Thank you, each of you, for joining me for this episode.
Thank you, Michelle.
Guests and listeners, that's it for today's episode of On the Issues with Michelle Goodwin at Ms. Magazine. I want to thank each of you for tuning in for the full story and engaging with us. We hope you'll join us again for our next episode, where we'll be reporting, rebelling, and telling it just like it is. For more information about what we discussed today, head to MsMagazine.com and be sure to subscribe. And if you believe, as we do, that women's voices matter, that equality for all persons cannot be delayed, and that rebuilding America and being unbought and unbossed and reclaiming our time are important, then be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to On the Issues with Michelle Goodwin at Ms. Magazine in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, wherever it is that you receive your podcast. We are ad-free and reader-supported. Help us reach new listeners by bringing this hard-hitting content in which you've come to expect and rely upon by subscribing. Let us know what you think about our show, and please support independent feminist media. Look for us at msmagazine.com for new content and special episode updates. And if you want to reach us, please do so. Email us at ontheissues@msmagazine.com. We do read our mail. This has been your host, Michelle Goodwin, reporting, rebelling, and telling it just like it is. On the Issues with Michelle Goodwin is a Ms. Magazine joint production. Michelle Goodwin and Kathy Spiller are our executive producers. Our producers for this episode are Roxy Zoll, Oliver Hogg, and also Allison Whelan. Our social media content producer is Sophia Panagrahi. The creative vision behind our work includes art and design by Brandy Phipps, editing by Natalie Holland, and music by Chris J. Lee.